Berlin, 1940. In a dimly lit war room filled with cigar smoke and polished boots, a group of high-ranking German generals crowded around a long oak table, their eyes fixated on a series of photographs recently intercepted from the United States. The images were black and white, slightly blurred, but the content was clear enough to spark amusement. A small, boxy vehicle with open sides, no roof, no armor, no visible weaponry, something that looked more suited for a farm trail than a battlefield. The general chuckled, breaking the silence. Before anything else, if you want the story behind the headlines direct, real, and without spin, subscribe and never miss a thing. This is what the Americans are building for war, he said, flipping the photo over with mockery. Another smirked. It looks like a toy. Is this supposed to fight our panzers? Laughter echoed through the room. One officer jokingly offered to send the Americans a Tiger tank brochure so they can understand what a real machine looks like. They didn't take it seriously. Why would they? At the time, the Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland and was steamrolling through France. The German war machine was the most advanced on the planet. The Tiger I was an armored behemoth, its 88mm cannon capable of obliterating enemy tanks from over 2 kilometers away. The Panther, sleek and devastating, balanced speed with armor in a way that was years ahead of its time. By comparison, the American vehicle was nothing short of laughable, small, thin, open to the elements. Its exposed wheels and low ground clearance seemed almost childish. There were no turrets, no thick armor plating, not even proper doors. Just a steering wheel, 3 seats, and an engine that barely purred. A colonel leaned forward and whispered, "This thing wouldn't last 5 minutes on the Eastern Front." The others agreed confidently. And why wouldn't they? Everything at that moment pointed to Germany's technological and tactical superiority. Their tanks, their blitzkrieg doctrine, their precision in engineering, it all worked. The Americans were, in their eyes, amateurs, unprepared, naive, still fantasizing about war like it was a cowboy movie. But what they didn't know, what not a single man in that room could have predicted, was that the vehicle in those blurry photographs was about to change the face of modern warfare. Forever, that toy wasn't just a vehicle. It was a philosophy. While the Germans were building machines that demanded elite crews, long maintenance hours, and complicated logistics, the Americans were building something else. A machine anyone could use. A machine that could be mass-produced, fixed in the field, driven by a farm boy or a factory worker with just a few hours of instruction. A machine so versatile that it would become a scout, an ambulance, a mobile command post, and eventually a legend. That was the beginning of the Jeep. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't sound like a threat. But it would become one of the most feared symbols of Allied power because it didn't matter how powerful the Tiger was, if it couldn't reach the fight. It didn't matter how well designed the Panther was, if it couldn't outrun or outmaneuver the thousands of Jeeps crawling across Europe. You see, while German generals laughed in that smoky room across the Atlantic, a revolution was brewing. Not of firepower, but of mobility. Not of destruction, but of domination by presence. The Jeep wouldn't need to win tank battles. It would simply go around them, through mud, across rivers, over mountains. It would be everywhere, all at once, all the time, and that's exactly what happened. But the irony didn't stop there, because 5 years later, when Berlin lay in ruins, when those same generals had been captured, when the Reich had collapsed, one of them would write in his diary, "We underestimated them. We thought they were building toys." But their toys were ghosts. They appeared in every forest, every town, every road. You didn't hear them until they were on top of you. You didn't see them until it was too late, and that's the twist of history. The vehicle that was laughed at would become the machine that outlasted the entire Nazi war machine, because war doesn't always go to the biggest, or the loudest, or the most powerful. Sometimes it goes to the most relentless. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of everything the Axis powers didn't understand: adaptability, simplicity, reliability. While the Germans built monsters, America built survivors. But what happened next? Because the Jeep story doesn't end with being underestimated. It starts there. What the Germans didn't know in 1940 was that the little machine they mocked would soon be the first wave of a full-scale industrial assault. And what happened in the factories of America would make that laughter disappear faster than any bullet ever could. America. 1940 Europe was already burning. Hitler's armies had swept through Poland, Denmark, Belgium, France, leaving only smoldering wreckage behind. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood still, observing, debating, hoping the storm wouldn't reach them. But deep down, military leaders knew war was coming. The problem? The US Army wasn't ready, not even close. It still used horse-mounted units. Tanks were outdated. Logistics were primitive. The Army had less than 500,000 personnel, and many of them were undertrained, under-equipped, and scattered. Worse yet, the industrial base hadn't yet shifted into wartime gear. While Germany had been preparing since the early 1930s, America was still debating isolationism in Congress. And then, in the middle of all that hesitation, the US Army issued one of the most absurd engineering requests in military history. They wanted a light reconnaissance vehicle, but not just any vehicle. It had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds. It had to have four-wheel drive. It needed to carry 3 fully equipped soldiers. It needed to climb a 30-degree incline. It had to be rugged, easily repairable, and foldable at the windshield. Oh, and they wanted the first prototype delivered in 49 days. All specs completed and tested in just 75 days. It was, by all accounts, impossible. The Army reached out to the biggest names in American automotive manufacturing. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, they all said the same thing. Impossible. The timeline was too short. The specs were unrealistic. The reward too uncertain. The war hadn't even started for America, and no one wanted to waste money on what might become nothing. But while giants said no, a tiny company whispered, "What if?" That company was Bantam Car Company, based in Butler, Pennsylvania. Bantam was a small operation hanging by a thread. Once a manufacturer of compact cars, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. The Depression had nearly killed them, and their workforce had shrunk to a skeleton crew. And yet, when no one else stepped forward, Bantam raised their hand. They had no money. They had no real factory. They didn't even have an engineering team in-house. What they did have was a phone number for one man. Carl Probst. Probst was a veteran engineer. Brilliant, practical, efficient. He had worked in Detroit for years and knew the ins and outs of automotive design. Bantam reached out, desperate. At first, he said no. Bantam couldn't even pay him. But after some persistence, and perhaps a bit of patriotism, he agreed. No salary. No guarantees. Just 2 days and a drawing board. Probst locked himself in a small office and started sketching. He used every shortcut, every piece of knowledge he'd gathered over his career. He reused existing parts from other vehicles. He cut every gram of weight he could. He focused on simplicity over elegance. In just 48 hours, the first blueprint for what would become the Jeep was complete. Then, Bantam's skeleton team went to work, welding, sawing, hammering. They worked day and night with salvaged parts, borrowed tools and second-hand equipment. Days later, the first prototype was ready. They called it the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, BRC. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect, but it ran. In September 1940, the prototype rolled into Camp Holabird, Maryland, for its first military test. Soldiers laughed when they saw it. It looked tiny, boxy. It had no roof, no doors, just a windshield that folded forward. Some said it looked like a kid's go-kart, but then the test began. The BRC flew over hills, climbed inclines other vehicles couldn't handle, drove through mud, over rocks, across streams. It didn't just meet expectations, it shattered them. It was light, tough, surprisingly fast. And most importantly, it could be repaired in the field with basic tools. By the end of the test, the Army officers weren't laughing anymore. They were taking notes, asking questions, calling Washington. This strange little vehicle might be exactly what the US Army had been missing. For Bantam, it felt like victory. After years of decline, they were about to be back in business in the biggest way possible. They had taken an impossible brief and delivered one engineer, one tiny shop, and a machine that could change the course of war. But then, just when they thought they had secured the contract of a lifetime, the Army hesitated. They had one concern, not about the vehicle, not about performance, but about scale. Could Bantam really build thousands of these? Could they mass produce for a global war? Could they keep up with supply demands, spare parts and logistics? The answer, unfortunately, was no. Bantam didn't have the facilities, didn't have the capital, didn't have the workforce. And so, in a move that would go down as one of the most controversial in military-industrial history, the Army gave Bantam's blueprints to other companies. They handed the plans to Willys Overland and Ford and told them, "Build your version of this. Make it better. Make it faster. We'll see who delivers best." Bantam had invented the Jeep, but they were about to lose it because in war, invention is only half the battle. Production wins wars, and Willys had an engine called the Go Devil, and what happened next would take the Bantam dream and turn it into an unstoppable force. But for now, in a tiny garage in Pennsylvania, a miracle had just been built, only to be handed over to someone else. What started as a blueprint on a desk was about to become the backbone of an empire. Washington, D.C., late 1940. The Bantam prototype had passed every test. It was agile, rugged, and cheap. The Army loved it. But there was one problem that even its solid performance couldn't solve. Scale Bantam was just too small. One military official put it bluntly. "They built one. Great. We need 10,000. The War Department reviewed Bantam's facilities and concluded the worst. The company didn't have the infrastructure, manpower, or supply chains to produce at the volume a global war would demand. And time was running out. The US was inching closer to the battlefield with every passing month, so the Army made a controversial decision. They handed over Bantam's blueprints, down to the last bolt, to Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company. The official reasoning: competition would produce the best design. Production would go to whoever could deliver fast, unofficially. It was survival through scale. This wasn't about who invented the idea. This was about who could flood the world with it. Bantam was stunned. They had taken all the risk, answered the impossible call, and now watched as industrial giants swooped in to profit from their design. It was, by every ethical measure, theft, but legal theft. Signed off by the US government still. Neither Willys nor Ford wasted time crying over morality. They went to work. Willys focused on performance. Their engineers immediately improved the design's engine. They installed the now famous Go Devil, a 2.2-liter, 60-horsepower beast that doubled the power of the original Bantam model. It gave the Jeep an entirely new life: more torque, more load capacity, and more endurance in rough terrain. The Willys prototype was called the Willys MA, Military Model A. Later, it would evolve into the Willys MB, the vehicle that would go down in history as the Jeep. Meanwhile, Ford brought what Ford always brought: mass production. They didn't just build a vehicle. They built an assembly line ecosystem. Factories were retooled, workers retrained, and parts standardized. Ford's version, the GPW, was nearly identical to the Willys MB, with one major difference: it was built for pure production efficiency. Ford's legendary logistics system allowed Jeeps to roll off the line at record speed. By 1941, the US Army had its answer. Both Willys and Ford would build the Jeep. Willys would be the main designer and supplier. Ford would provide mass-scale manufacturing support. Every part, down to the bolts and bolts threads, was standardized. A part from a Willys MB could fit perfectly on a Ford GPW. This meant that any Jeep, anywhere in the world, could be repaired on the spot using common spares. The result? Production exploded. By 1942, Jeeps were rolling off the line at a pace of one every 90 seconds. Factories ran around the clock. Men and women worked side by side on the lines, many for the first time. Even high school students were recruited into training programs to support wartime assembly. The U.S. industrial machine shifted into full war mode. Civilian car production was halted. Appliance companies started making Jeep parts. Steel, rubber, and paint were rationed and redirected to Willys and Ford. The Jeep became more than a vehicle. It became a national priority. This wasn't just about supply anymore. It was about message, about momentum, about making sure when American boots hit foreign soil, they didn't land alone. They'd be followed by four wheels and a star. By the end of 1943, over 200,000 Jeeps had been delivered. By the end of the war, over 640,000 tons. It was a logistical miracle, but not everyone celebrated. Inside Bantam's small office in Pennsylvania, the mood was bitter. They continued producing trailers and a small number of Jeeps for non-combat roles. But the main contract, the one they had sparked, was gone. One executive reportedly said, "We won the race," but they gave the trophy to someone else. It was a quiet tragedy. The story of the little company that had done the impossible, only to watch the giants win. Still, the army didn't care who built it, only that it was built, and it was. The Jeep was now a symbol of American speed, of American flexibility, of American readiness, and yet a question lingered in the minds of many military officers. This thing was fast, cheap, easy to repair, but could it survive? Could it really handle the mud, the snow, the bullets, the landmines? Could this unarmored, open-top, four-cylinder vehicle really survive war? The factories had proven their power. Now, it was time for the battlefield to decide. Liverpool, 1941. The rain hadn't stopped in days. Cold wind whipped through the docks as British soldiers unloaded crates from American cargo ships. Among them were odd-looking vehicles the British had never seen before. Small, boxy, with open tops and exposed wheels. Someone muttered, "Is this a joke?" They weren't armored. They weren't enclosed. They didn't even look like military hardware. British officers raised eyebrows. After years of fighting with thick-plated Matilda tanks and rigid command structures, this new American arrival looked like something built in a backyard garage. What they were looking at was the Jeep, and very soon their skepticism would disappear, because just weeks later, in the burning sands of North Africa, the Jeep made its combat debut. In a theater defined by extremes, heat, sand, rocks, and relentless dust, conventional vehicles struggled. But the Jeep thrived. Its light frame, four-wheel drive, and simple mechanics made it ideal for desert warfare. No one realized this faster than the Long-Range Desert Group, Britain's elite reconnaissance and raiding force. These were men who traveled hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, often cut off from supply or support for days. The Jeep changed everything. It could carry extra fuel tanks. It could be fitted with machine guns, Vickers, Lewis, or even captured German MG-34s. It could be rigged for radio communications, serving as mobile command posts. And most importantly, it could go anywhere. British soldiers began calling it a miracle in the sand. The Jeep quickly adapted. Field modifications became standard. Crews removed the windshield, added armor plates, attached weapon mounts, welded racks for ammo and jerry cans. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it became a canvas for combat innovation, and its reputation spread. In the Italian campaign, Jeeps climbed steep mountain trails where tanks couldn't follow. They slipped through narrow alleyways in bombed-out towns. Medics transformed them into ambulances. Commanders used them as rolling headquarters. Some were even equipped with loudspeakers to broadcast surrender orders to German troops. Everywhere the Allies advanced, the Jeep went first. It wasn't long before German soldiers started recognizing the distinct sound of its engine, a low, whirring growl, fast and light. They began to dread it. The Germans had their own light vehicle, the Kübelwagen, designed by Volkswagen. It was sleek, fuel-efficient, and mechanically reliable, but it wasn't four-wheel drive. It lacked the off-road capability. In sand and snow, it failed where the Jeeps surged forward. German motorcycles like the BMW R75 offered speed, but were unstable in rough terrain. The massive Tiger tanks were unstoppable in theory, but they were also slow, heavy and gas-hungry. In contrast, the Jeep was quick, flexible, disposable. Even soldiers could lift it out of a ditch with just 4 men. When damaged, it could be fixed in minutes using spare parts, scrap metal, even wood. If a tire blew, it was changed in seconds. If an axle bent, it was hammered back into shape. There's a story from Tunisia. A Jeep ran over a mine. The front wheel was torn off, the fender destroyed. But the crew survived. They dragged the vehicle out of the blast zone, tied a log where the wheel had been, and drove it back to base. Slowly, but they made it. In France, after D-Day, Jeeps became the backbone of the advance. Supply lines moved on Jeeps. Recon patrols moved on Jeeps. Wounded soldiers escaped death because of a Jeep that got them to a medic in time. One American lieutenant said, "We didn't march through Europe. We rolled through it." In Jeeps and in winter, while German engines froze, Jeeps kept starting. They didn't need complex heating systems. Just a wrench, some oil, and a lot of stubbornness. In Soviet Russia, Jeeps arrived by the thousands via Lend-Lease. Red Army troops admired their toughness. They called them little tanks. Soviet officers used them to scout positions. Snipers used them to relocate. In cities like Stalingrad and Kursk, they moved through rubble like rats in a maze. German command began reporting strange patterns. Enemy patrols appear where no roads exist. Jeep tracks found in zones previously believed inaccessible. This wasn't a vehicle anymore. This was a ghost, the kind that appeared in the night, fired a few shots, and vanished into the terrain. The kind that made enemies afraid of the space between battles. Jeep crews were often called phantoms on wheels because they didn't wait for the road. They didn't need clearance. They didn't follow orders to halt. They went where the enemy wasn't looking until it was too late, and this adaptability became the Jeep's true power. It wasn't better than German vehicles in one category. It was better in all the categories that mattered, light enough to fly in gliders, small enough to hide in ruins, fast enough to chase or flee, simple enough to fix on the move, while the Germans built machines that needed perfect conditions. The Allies drove Jeeps through hell, but even all of that wasn't the Jeep's final weapon, because it wasn't just about what the Jeep could do. It was about how many of them could do it, tens of thousands. Rolling across Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, over beaches, through jungles, across rivers. The invasion wasn't just soldiers, it was engines. It was wheels. It was Jeeps, and what came next would turn that number into a weapon even the Tiger couldn't defeat. From 1941 to 1945, the United States didn't just fight a war, it built one. Factories didn't sleep. Assembly lines didn't stop. Steel, rubber, manpower, everything was redirected toward one mission: overwhelm the enemy with scale. And at the heart of that industrial tsunami was the most unexpected weapon of all. Jeep Tunsit 43,000. That's how many Jeeps were produced by Willys and Ford during World War II. It's a number that doesn't even seem real until you see the photos, parking lots filled with identical machines, rows of olive-drab vehicles stretching to the horizon like military crops ready to be harvested. Compare that to Nazi Germany, just 50,000 Kubelwagens in the same period. A fraction, a whisper. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a flood, and that flood hit every front at once: France, Italy, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, Siberia, Germany itself. Everywhere the Allies went, the Jeep was there first. And part of the magic? The Jeep was designed to travel as a kit. Each one could be broken down into major components: chassis, body, engine, wheels. They were packed into crates like IKEA furniture, shipped overseas in massive numbers. On the front lines, soldiers would pull them out, grab a wrench, and build a war machine in 30 minutes flat. No engineers required. No manuals needed. No questions asked. because by 1943, every soldier already knew the Jeep inside out. It was the great democratizer of the battlefield. Everyone knew how to drive it. Everyone knew how to fix it. Everyone relied on it. Mechanics loved it. Officers trusted it. Soldiers depended on it. A U.S. infantryman once said, "If I had to choose between reinforcements and a Jeep, I'd take the Jeep, because with a Jeep, I could find the reinforcements myself." That's not just loyalty. That's a logistical revolution. The Jeep became the bloodstream of the Allied military. It moved ammo. It moved wounded. It moved food, radios, commanders, maps, morale. It was fast enough to dodge artillery, small enough to hide behind rubble, light enough to cross makeshift bridges or be lifted by 6 men over a ravine. It wasn't precious. It was present, always. Some units had more Jeeps than rifles. Others used them for everything: day patrols, night raids, emergency retreats. And the effect wasn't just physical, it was psychological. To Allied troops, the sound of a Jeep engine meant help was on the way. It meant ammo. It meant food. It meant medevac. To the enemy, it meant trouble. Germans came to recognize the soft growl of the Jeep's 4-cylinder engine as a prelude to raids, scouts, or fresh forces moving in fast. A whisper of wheels in the dark. And then gunfire. The Jeep was the noise between silences. Some German POWs reported hearing them more often than seeing them. They were ghosts on wheels, quiet, swift, everywhere at once. They were seen crossing mountains where tanks failed, floating off landing craft under heavy fire, zipping through villages faster than mines could be laid. In the Pacific, Marines used them in jungles and on volcanic ash. In Russia, Red Army officers rode American Jeeps into Berlin. In Italy, they raced along cliffside roads under sniper fire. In Normandy, they carried the wounded off the beach under explosions. The Jeep was never just behind the lines. It was at the line, in front of it, sometimes even behind enemy lines. And that sheer mass changed everything, because when you have one vehicle that can do anything and you have hundreds of thousands of them, you don't just move faster, you fight smarter. The German war machine, built on precision, innovation, and elite craftsmanship, found itself outmaneuvered by a fleet of simple, unstoppable clones. Tigers broke down. Panthers needed recovery crews. Kübelwagens spun out in the mud, but the Jeep? You could push start it with 3 guys and a hill. You could patch its fuel line with chewing gum. You could tie the hood down with rope and drive it through enemy fire. It wasn't elegant. It was inevitable, and every new Jeep shipped overseas meant one more artery of war pumping faster. America didn't need to win with firepower alone. It won with movement, with flexibility, with presence, and presence came on 4 wheels, covered in mud, with a star painted on the hood. By 1944, the Jeep had become the face of the Allied advance. Photographers captured them in every major operation. Reporters rode in them. Generals made speeches from them. Chaplains held sermons beside them. It was the icon of liberation. In France, children waved at Jeeps filled with GIs, tossing chocolate. In Poland, resistance fighters rode them during final offensives. In Germany, civilians watched them roll past with disbelief, because it wasn't just that the Americans were coming. It was how they were coming. Fast, mobile, endless, in Jeeps. By the time Berlin fell, no one was laughing anymore. The little car they once called a toy was now everywhere. It had outnumbered, outlasted, outperformed, and while the Jeep wasn't the biggest, strongest, or most feared weapon of the war, it may have been the most important, because tanks win battles, but Jeeps, they win wars. And while the world celebrated victory, a new question loomed. What happens when the enemy's greatest weakness is their belief in their own superiority? Because while Jeeps multiplied by the thousands, Germany began sinking under its own arrogance. Germany, 1945. Snow clung to the edges of ruined buildings. Roads were shattered. Bridges lay twisted. Cities were hollow shells, their windows blown out, their walls scorched black. And across that frozen wasteland, a sound echoed that German generals had once laughed at, the hum of a Jeep engine. What started as mockery in 1940 had become the sound of collapse by 1945. One captured general later wrote in his personal journal, "They looked like ghosts. They appeared from nowhere. They had no armor, no mass, but they were everywhere." For the German High Command, so proud of its engineering, its steel beasts, its mechanical discipline, the irony was brutal. They had built the most mechanized army in history. Precision tanks, tactical half-tracks, artillery with onboard range-finding, and yet when it all crumbled, they retreated on foot, not because they lacked bravery, but because they lacked movement. Fuel had run dry. Steel had run out. Trucks and tanks sat abandoned on roadsides. Bridges had been bombed, supply chains shattered. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced not with armor columns alone, but with thousands of jeeps, swarming through open terrain around wreckage, under fire. And these weren't just vehicles, they were the doctrine made visible. The Jeep represented everything the US military had embraced. Simplicity, redundancy, modularity, speed over spectacle, utility over prestige. While Germany designed masterpieces, the US built solutions. And the results were undeniable. Civilians in retreat, fleeing Allied bombardments on foot, in carts, on bicycles, watched American forces pass them by in long, steady columns of jeeps. Some waved white cloth. Some stared in stunned silence. They'd grown up being told that German engineering was the pinnacle of the modern world. Now they were watching that world collapse under the wheels of what had once been called a toy. And the final insult? When Germany finally surrendered, it was a jeep that carried the surrender documents, not a tank, not a staff car, not a grand limousine, just a small, olive-green four-wheel vehicle, dusty, dented, driven by an American sergeant who didn't even salute as he handed them off. That's how the war ended, not with the roar of engines, but with the soft rumble of a jeep, the same jeep they had laughed at. That vehicle became the symbol of victory. It was photographed in Paris with cheering crowds. It led liberation parades in Belgium and the Netherlands. It crossed rivers in Italy, crept through rubble in Warsaw, rolled into Berlin without needing a new coat of paint. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't intimidating, but it never stopped moving. And after the war, something strange happened. Countries didn't just want peace treaties. They wanted jeeps. France, Norway, Japan, Brazil, the Philippines. They saw what the jeep could do. They understood what it meant. It became the foundation for post-war militaries, for police forces, for farmers, for explorers. Even civilians wanted them, because the jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was an idea that freedom could move. That toughness didn't need to be complicated. That what worked in war could thrive in peace. And that idea outlived the Reich, outlived the generals, outlived the blueprints of every German tank that broke down in the mud. Let's not forget how this started. In 1940, a group of German officers laughed at a photograph, a little unarmored, open-top American vehicle. One of them said, "That wouldn't last 5 minutes on the Eastern Front." 5 years later, it had crossed the Eastern Front and the Western Front and the beaches of Normandy, and the Alps of Italy, and the jungles of the Pacific, and the snow of Bastogne. It had carried medics, spies, generals, and prisoners. It had outrun tanks, outclimbed motorcycles, outlasted bureaucracy. It became the only vehicle seen in every major theater of the war, and it ended that war not by firing a shot, but by showing up everywhere. That's the lesson. Victory doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't the biggest. It's the one that's always there, moving, working, never asking for attention, never needing a spotlight, just doing the job over and over and over again. That was the Jeep. And if you're wondering, what came next? Well, history has a way of repeating itself, because decades later, the US military would face the same skepticism. This time not from tanks, but from the sky. They introduced another laughable project. Something too small, too light, too fragile, a flying toy. And yet today, that toy controls the skies. Want to know what it is? It's the drone, ridiculed, doubted, dismissed. But now, it's on every battlefield, in every intelligence operation. over every front line. If the Jeep won the ground war, the drone is winning the next one. And in the next episode, we're going to show you how the US military took the most underestimated machine since the Jeep and turned it into a silent predator. So if this story surprised you, subscribe, turn on notifications, and get ready, because what's coming next might just change the way you see the future of war. If you want more stories like this, clear, verified, and unfiltered, subscribe now and stay one step ahead of everyone.